بنی آدم از یکدیگرند که در آفرینش ز یک جوهرند، چو عضو به در آورد روزگار، دیگر عضوها را نماند قرار. بیننده‌های نهایت عزیز و گرامی، شما را به برنامه رویدادهای روز خوش آمدید میگم. با من عبدالحنان نوز از شهر کوپن هاگن دنمارک با شما مخاطب هستم. طوری که در شعر سعدی بزرگوار برای شما گفته شد، هر جایی که یک حادثه میشه، هر جایی که درد میشه، هر جایی که رنج میباشه، تمام هموطنان، همنوان ما را در سراسر جهان به تکان و درد مشترک وامی داره. جای بس افتخار به این است که در عصر امروزی ما تکنولوژی، میدیا و وسایل اطلاعات جمعی باعث شده که همه انسان ها را با هم نزدیک بسازه و در هر کجایی که باشند در راه صدای حقیقت دست بلند داشته باشند، گام بردارن، قلم بردارن و قدم رنجه کنن. جوانان ما در شهر کوپن هاگن یک سمینار و یک کنفرانس را برگزار کردند که این جوانان در انجمن یا نهاد دیاکتیف هستند که یک مخفف اسم است که اینا برای خود انتخاب کرده که از مجموعه کار و فعالیتشان است و مدتی است که برای بانوان افغانستان کار و خدمت میکنن. در عرصه انکشاف و اعمار افغانستان کارهای زیاد دارن، در عرصه اقتصاد، در عرصه تعلیم، تربیه و به خصوص بر زنان رنجدیده افغانستان که از علم و تعلیم و تحصیل باز ماندن. برای جوانان عزیز خود موفقیت و سرافرازی آرزو میکنم. تشکر از والدینشان که چنین آگاهی را برشان رسانده و حمایتشان میکنه. نه تنها حمایت والدین است بلکه حمایت هموطنان است، حمایت آنانی که وطن و مردم خود دوست داره آنها هستند. به همین دلیل است که اثباتی گپ ما در کنفرانسی که برگزار کردن نماینده خاص ملل متحد که جناب ریچارد بنت است که بعد از سالهای بسیار طولانی در عرصه حقوق بشر برای افغانستان توظیف شده و یگانه فردی است که با گفته خودش گفت من صدای زنان و کودکان مردم افغانستان هستم. یعنی تا فعلا همه دنیا که افغانستان رو به فراموشی سپرده، این یگانه فرد است که از طرف ملل متحد میره به داخل افغانستان، هر آنچه که سر مردم میگذره میبینه و برای جامعه ملل متحد میگه و به خصوص در شورای امنیت نقش مهم داره که اینا گزارش چشمدید خودش میگذاره. قابل یادآوری است که جوانان ما از کشور سویدن، از کشور همسایه، از وین، از همه جا آمده بودن و در این کنفرانس اشتراک کردن. خوبی دی بود که اینا به زبان انگلیسی صحبت میکردن و مورد توجه و علاقه دنمارکی ها هم قرار داشت. به این معنی که دنمارک و حکومت دنمارک در قضای افغانستان زیدخل است. اینا سرباز داشتن در هلمند، در جنگ اشتراک داشتن، تلفات داشتن در افغانستان. یک کشور خرد 5 میلیونی حدود 30 تا 37 تن از سربازانشان اوجه از بین رفته. به این معنی که اینا جمعاً ناتو، امریکا، شورای امنیت، جامعه جهانی همه در قضای افغانستان زیدخل است. یعنی در کل همه مسئولیت دارن که باید در قسمت تامین امنیت در افغانستان توجه کنند. به همین خاطر بود که در کنفرانس منعقد کوپن هاگن اعضای پارلمان دنمارک 2 تن از شخصیت‌های سیاسی که به اونجا اشتراک داشتن، دنمارکی‌ها اشتراک داشتن، افغان‌ها، همه از نهادها اونجا حضور داشتن، صحبت‌های داشتن و در مورد افغانستان تبادل نظر کردن، سوال کردن، پاسخ شنیدن، راه مختلف را گفتن. امیدوار هستم تا این کنفرانس ها، تا این نشست ها بیشتر و بیشتر گردد تا افغانستان از فراموشی برای یک حکومت داشته باشیم با اختیار مردم باشه، حکومت داشته باشیم که منافع مردم ده او باشه، منافع مشترک ملی ده او باشه، یک حکومت داشته باشیم که دیگه برای دخترها و پسرها همه مکتب باشه، آرامش باشه، آسایش باشه و همه زیر یک بیرق، زیر یک نام در حفظ و امنیت باشه. این وظیفه و رسالت هر انسان در روی زمین است که در مورد افغانستان باید توجه کنه. به خاطر هر کشوری که عضو ملل متحد است در قضای افغانستان زیدخل است و هر کشور و هر فردش که مالیه پرداخته او کشورش به ملل متحد و از طریق ملل متحد در افغانستان به جنگ و نابودی افغانستان کشانده شده. سخن کوتاه می‌سازیم. در اینجا جوانان که اشتراک داشتن، از جمله یک تن از شخصیت فرهیخته سیاسی و اجتماعی ما بانو هیله نجیب است. بانو هیله نجیب شما میشناسین که دختر شهید دکتر نجیب الله هستند و اینا در کنار مهاجرت، مسافرت، تحصیل وقت خود وقف مردم و وطنش میکنه. با وجودی که از وطن دور بزرگ شده، احساسشان با مردم است و راهشان خدمت به مردم است. اونا هم تشریف داشتن، سخنان داشتن و تبادل تجربه کردن. برشان موفقیت و سرافرازی آرزو میکنم. در تمام کارهایشان سعادت و موفق و کامگار باشن. بیننده‌های عزیز و نهایت گرامی، وقت شما را نمیگیرم. اگر این برنامه مکمل و نشر نرسید، برای شما وعده میکنم تا در قسمت‌های مختلف پخش شود. به زبان انگلیسی است و با مخاطر است که شما را میتونین با دوستانتان شریک بسازین. در هر کشوری که هستین، از طریق صفحات شما دیگه مردم جهان از معلومات در مورد افغانستان آگاه میشه. پس وقت شما را نگرفته، میریم قسمت اول برنامه رو میبینیم و قسمت‌های بعدیش در برنامه بعدی بر شما شریک میسازم. لطفاً با ما باشید و این برنامه را با دوستانتان شریک بسازید و حتی آنانی که با این زبان دسترسی نداره، شما همراهشون همکاری کنین و برشان ترجمه کنین تا همه مفهوم و تفهیم باشه. ناگفته نباید گذاشت. اگر شما سوالات دارین برای ما بفرستین تا در کنفرانس بعدی پرسش به عمل بیاید و با یک راه حل برای کشور خود نائل آییم. برای شما بیننده عزیز، برای جوانانی که زحمت کشیده، برای همه دوستانی که به خاطر وطن و مردم و همنوانشان زحمت میکشه، سعادت و کامیابی آرزو میکنم. در هر کجایی که هستین، در حفظ و امان خالق یکتا باشین. لطفاً این برنامه را با دوستانتان شریک بسازید.
من الهه سالک هستم، عضو دکدیف. دکدیف یک انجمن است که به خاطر حق و حقوق زنان افغان کار میکنه. ما به خاطر حق و حقوق زنان افغانستان در افغانستان مخصوصاً کار میکنیم. یکی از اهداف ما همی است که صدای خانم‌های افغان به دنیا و به جهانیان برسانیم. امروز برنامه امروز به خاطر گرفته بودیم که تا 2 هفته دیگه 2 سال از آمدن طالبان به افغانستان میشه که مخصوصاً حق و حقوق زنای افغان در افغانستان پایمال شده و ما میخواستیم که صدای اونا رو به جهانیان برسانیم و برای افغانها، همه افغانهای افغانستان و خانمهای افغان مخصوصاً بگوییم که ما اونا رو فراموش نکردیم و نمیگذاریم که همه دنیا اونا رو فراموش بکنن و ما با اونا هستیم و همیشه میباشیم.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to today's conference on Afghanistan, 2 years after the takeaway, challenges and ways forward. This conference is organized by Dakdif, Danish Afghan Diaspora Forum, and Crossing Borders. My name is Zora Faisi, and I am a board member of Dakdif and your MC for today. Before we dive into engaging discussions and enlightening presentation, let's go over to some housekeeping rules. And it's to ensure a smooth and respectful environment. So, firstly, please switch your cell phones to silent mode. Thank you. To minimize disruption. Secondly, please, as we all value the principle of respect and inclusivity, let's engage in a manner where we accept and respect different opinions. And to ensure that our conference runs smoothly and on schedule, I kindly request that all speakers, including moderators, stick to their time limit. So, I have prepared 2 cards to alert moderator and speakers about the time they have left. So I will raise yellow one, which means that you have 1 minute left, and I will raise red one, which means time is up. And that's my card. So thank you so much. And with regard to photography and recording, if you do not want to be included, please inform me or my colleague Tamina Saleh. And if you're thinking, how can I support Dakdif's work? Well, you can make a donation through mobile pay or through our website. Now, let me provide you with an overview of today's program. We will have two starting remarks, opening remarks by my colleague Tamina Saleh and UN Special Reporter on the Situation of Human Rights in Afghanistan, Mr. Richard Benin. Their insight will set the stage for discussion. And then, following the opening remarks, we will have Ms. Hila Najibullah as our keynote speakers, who will offer a valuable perspective on the current situation in Afghanistan. After that, we will transition to our first panel discussion, focusing on gender mainstreaming and in aid programs and concept of gender apartheid. The session will be moderated by Mr. Rashad Jalali, who will guide our panelists in exploring this important topic. Following the panel discussion, we will have a short 15 minutes break, which is a coffee break or tea break. And after that, we will have our second and final panel, which will center on the importance of national dialogue process. Mr. Ali Ahmad will moderate the session, and lastly, we will conclude our conference with closing remarks by my colleague, Ms. Ilaha Saleh, who will offer insights and reflection on the key takeaway from today's conference. So once again, thank you all for joining us today on a Sunday. And I hope that our collective effort will contribute to a deeper understanding of Afghanistan and pave the way to the light from this dark night. Now, it's a great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. She is founder and chairperson of Dakdif. Dakdif works to eliminate gender-based violence in Afghanistan and supports women in their fight for human rights, while also raising international awareness about the challenges Afghan women face. Through Dakdif, she is advocating for women's rights in Afghanistan and abroad. She's also co-founder and chairperson of NGO Paris, where she has been instrumental in the organization's effort to combat poverty by establishing micro-business for Afghans. And moreover, she served as co-owner of Warfare and advisory board member at DRC TIPS program. She is Ms. Tamina Saleh.
Thank you, Zahra, and so glad to see you all. I think I will use my 5 minutes on telling how do I know the Taliban. I know them as the reason for my parents to leave their homeland and take refuge in a new country, Denmark, today my new homeland. Leaving behind everything they knew and they loved to become refugees in Denmark. They are the ones who robbed me of my right to education when I was just a child, and robbed my mom from her right to work when they were first in power at the first round of, in their power. Last year, when I traveled back to Kabul, the emptiness of the offices and homes of my family's aunts and cousins were speaking volumes. I imagined them months ago walking those streets with hopes and dreams. But today, they're starting over in a new land, each brother and sister charting a different path in a different country. Once again, millions had to leave their homeland. Afghanistan's struggle is real, and the pain runs deep. Yet the world over, often overlooks their voices, assessing their lives and opinions through the lens of tourist and distant think tanks. We hear the realities of Afghanistan from white men who visit, while the NGOs tell us what the working class wants. It's a constant disrespect to the people who are living these realities every day. Efforts by the international community to soften the Taliban's ideology have been unsuccessful, as their rigid thinking remains unchanged. Present endeavors to address Afghanistan's humanitarian and economical crisis overlooks the political roots driving the turmoil. It is a political problem, not economical. Despite the international community's attempts to convince the Taliban to embrace more moderate governance, their extremism has only intensified since regaining power. The Taliban remains steadfast in their refusal to alter their worldview, relying on the belief that the global interests will eventually grant them a recognition. We know that the violent extremist of the Taliban is not who Afghans are. It is foreign to our spirit, and it will eventually falter and fail. I'm sure of it. Our resilience, our unwavering determination to resist is what makes us strong. Afghans may be displaced and disheartened, but our dream of a better Afghanistan, a free and just Afghanistan, will never be extinguished. But let us not forget the heavy price we pay for dreaming or daring to dream. For seeking a more humane society, we have experienced uncertainty, displacement, and the horror of prison, torture, and violence. Our hearts, minds, and bodies bear the scars of oppression, so do those of our families and friends. Together, let us continue to raise our voices, to fight for our rights, and to stand united against oppression. All of us, Afghans and non-Afghans, all of you who are here. As long as we hold on to our collective dream, we will overcome the darkness that surrounds us. We will emerge victorious, for the power of our shared humanity will always triumph over the forces of hatred and extremism. Together, let us work toward a future where Afghanistan is not just a land of diverse realities, which we hear so often, but a land of hope, progress, and peace. Our journey may be difficult, but we will forge ahead with strength in our hearts and unity in our souls. Thank you.
Especially for the time, it was amazing. So now it is my honor to introduce our next distinguished speaker, who is a UN Special Reporter in the situation of human rights in Afghanistan. He has a long career working in Afghanistan on several occasions in different capacities, including as the chief of UNAMA. He has previously played a role in the promotion and protection of human rights in Afghanistan and supported the UN on a number of human rights issues. Since August 2021, he has conducted several visits to Afghanistan and published several reports on the human rights situation in Afghanistan, including the recent one on Afghan women. He is Mr. Richard Bennett.
Assalamu alaikum. Tashakkur Zora Jan for your very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to join you today to give some thought both to the challenges 2 years after the Taliban takeover and for the ways forward. I'm very moved by your introductory remarks, Tamina, because I could hear in your voice the pain that you continue to feel, and I'm sure it's shared by many, if not most, in this room. But you also ended on a very hopeful note, that it's important not to remain paralyzed with the pain, but to look for the possibility of a way forward, and to look, I think as Zora said, for the light at the end of the dark night. So I salute your resilience and the resilience of all who are peacefully resisting the Taliban's violent repression of human rights, including especially the rights of women and girls in Afghanistan. I've been introduced, and thank you for that. Maybe I take a moment to explain what my role is. I'm appointed as the Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in Afghanistan by the UN, United Nations Human Rights Council. That is, I'm appointed by the member states of the UN, including Denmark, actually. And so I report not to the Secretary General or to the High Commissioner for Human Rights. I report directly to the member states. That's who I'm responsible for. But my real accountability is to the people of Afghanistan, is to you. So it's your wishes, your voices that are the most important. I am afraid that I'm one of the white men who visit Afghanistan. And as you've noted, I have visited 3 times in just over a year. I started in May last year. And actually, it is a bit of a challenge in itself. It's a balance, because I've still been able to visit, allowed to visit, but I've also spoken out. And a lot of people ask me, how do you manage to keep visiting if you speak out strongly? Well, I don't know. But we'll keep trying, and I hope that it will be able to continue. It should, in fact, be Afghan voices that are the loudest, not my voice. And I really just want to amplify your voices. But I also know that it's difficult for you to speak out loudly sometimes, because many of you have family back in Afghanistan. And you're rightly, in my view, concerned about their security and safety should you express views that are different from those that are considered acceptable. I think after 2 years of Taliban being in power, we're pretty clear about their direction. Is to create an Islamic emirate in their image, the way they see it, as they did in the 1990s. And despite their promises to be different this time around, when they took power, they have not fulfilled those promises. Their violations have been widespread and systematic, especially against women and girls, and also Hazara and other ethnic and religious minorities are targeted, as are members of the former security forces, the ANDSF, human rights defenders, journalists, generally members of civil society, and even some civil servants from the Republic. What we've seen is a tightening step by step, not all at once. There's been about 60 separate decrees or instructions or edicts by the Taliban's leader, increasingly restricting the rights of women and girls. So this is the policy, to go step by step. And I think the most recent, I think, was the ban on beauty salons. That was a little bit surprising, because until then the Taliban had said that they don't restrict the private sector, that they do recognize women's right to run business. So I think all of you noticed that, especially as the Prophet's wife ran a business. And so that was a bit surprising. My own interpretation is that they are not very keen on women getting together and talking, and finding that threatening. But it's also, you could see another interpretation, which is that it was perhaps one of the few pleasures left for women. So this misogynistic approach is to do everything to remove any kind of enjoyment in life that women may have. So I'm afraid I can't bring much good news. I think it's likely to continue in that direction and to get worse before it gets better. It will get better. Eventually, it will get better. But I think we are in for a long haul. And as you all know, and as set out in many reports, including my own reports, when the Taliban took over, the constitution of Afghanistan, 2004 constitution, was set aside, as were most of the key institutions, Parliament, the Ministry of Women's Affairs, the Electoral Commission, the Human Rights Commission, all disbanded. So what it is really is an authoritarian theocracy. We are pretty unclear about how laws are applied. The Taliban talk about the application of Sharia. They're not very clear about the situation of the laws that existed when they took over. On one hand, there's mixed messaging. One message is that they're all abolished, the other message is that's not the case, that they still apply provided they're not in conflict with Sharia. So this uncertainty creates a lot of confusion and difficulty and stress. I'll also mention the humanitarian crisis, and one of you mentioned that this is not only a humanitarian crisis. I can't remember which one of you. Zora Otamina mentioned that. I think it might have been Tamina. It's a political crisis, and more than anything, it's a human rights crisis. Sure, it is a very difficult humanitarian situation, and the funds for humanitarian aid have decreased a great deal this year. They've gone down a lot. They're nowhere near what the UN has requested. They're only at around 20-25%, I think. And that will create a lot of difficulties later on, possibly in the coming winter. Let me just perhaps move forward a little bit, because I don't know how much time. I haven't seen the yellow card yet, so I haven't it's still got more time. A good friend of mine, an Afghan woman, I think she might have been speaking for many others when she said to me, our worst fear was that the Taliban would come back into power on their own. And our second worst fear is that they would be recognized. The worst fear has already taken place. And I think the focus now is on avoiding the second worst fear. So far, the Taliban regime has not been recognized yet by any country or by the UN system. However, they have made inroads, especially in the region. They've been able to establish consular or diplomatic posts in about 7 countries now, without being officially recognized. I doubt that they are going to, I don't control this, but I doubt that they will be recognized by the UN. This would be a decision of the accreditation committee at the UN General Assembly. It'll possibly come up later, towards the end of this year. But what I'm hearing, when I visited New York recently, and I came back from Washington yesterday, my sense is that they are not likely to be recognized at the UN. Nevertheless, I'm very concerned about a kind of creeping, slow normalization. And rather than formal recognition, that I think should be part of our focus. So, maybe I see that the theme of this conference 2 years after the Taliban takeover, challenges and the ways forward. Well, perhaps the challenges are not too difficult to identify. The ways forward are a bit more difficult, but I'm really glad that you are all thinking about that. Perhaps I'll start by quoting you again, Tamila. One of the groups of women who are a collective to support women's rights calls themselves Together Stronger. And I think that's a really good thing. It's really important to stay together. And Zora, you started off by saying, let's, in this meeting, respect and accept different opinions. And I think that is a really good message for all of us. The Taliban don't accept different opinions. Any kind of dissent or even difference of opinion is regarded as an offense. We mustn't be the same. We need to be a broad coalition supporting human rights and women's rights, but giving space within that to allow for some differences. Other ways forward. Well, the Taliban should be called to account for their violence and their human rights violations, some of which appear to amount to international crimes. We shouldn't forget, however, that there are others, including Islamic State, also active in Afghanistan, who are notorious in particular for their intolerance of Shia and for their brutal attacks on Shia, particularly Hazara, not only though. So I'll speak to this, I'm on a panel and I was going to speak to this point a bit more on the panel. I've discussed already the issue of recognition or non-recognition, and that it's a human rights and a political crisis. We're in Europe. Europe is rather obsessed, understandably, taken up with the crisis in Ukraine. It's very important that we and you raise voices to keep the spotlight also on the crisis in Afghanistan. And it's Europe's responsibility to address this crisis as well. My view is that humanitarian aid should continue. I know that there are some views that it should be reduced or stopped. That will hurt Afghans, ordinary Afghans, even more. I've got the yellow card now, 1 more minute. But there need to be stricter measures to ensure that it reaches those most in need and is not diverted. I think we also need to spend more time drawing the link between what's happening in Afghanistan and in the surrounding countries to Afghans and the issues that Europe cares about, the issues of terrorism and of immigration. Pretending that this will be contained within Afghanistan is false, in my view. There is a link between the ill treatment of Afghans, particularly women and girls, but also boys, and the possibility of problems across the borders and out of the region that we've seen before and we may see again. I think, just to finalize, it's important to have a plan going forward. Where do you want to be? Where do we want to be in another 2 years, in another 5 years? I think we would support a peace process towards an inclusive government. Certainly mitigation of and reduction of the human rights violations. But just to end with throwing a few questions out there. What's the alternative right now to the rule of the Taliban? I'd love to hear what your thoughts are about that. What does success look like? What does failure look like? Thinking ahead. How can 45 years of conflict be ended? And what is the role of transitional justice in that approach and standing up for human rights? I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
Mr. Richard, thank you so much for the strong closing and also the message of togetherness. So before we move to our next speaker, I kindly ask you all to stand and observe a moment of silence to honor the innocent victim of senseless tragedies that are happening every day in Afghanistan. Let this moment serve as a time for us to come together in reflection, keeping the victims and their families close to our heart, while we acknowledge their pain and loss. I kindly please stand. Thank you all for your attention. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my utmost pleasure to introduce the next speaker. And she is the keynote speaker. She is a researcher and a PhD candidate at the UZH and has done her MA in Peace, Conflict Transformation and Security Studies. She is the author of the book Reconciliation and Social Healing in Afghanistan. And she has extensive humanitarian work experience on migration with the International Federation of the Red Cross. She is Miss Hila Najibullah.
Hamatoran Aziz, friends, Danish friends, and friends of humanity. Good day and good morning to you. I thank you for being here and for our friends Damir John and Daktif, Yuzora John, to be able to enable us and raise our voices. I had written a speech for today, but after Mr. Bennett's conversation, I wonder how much of my speech do I have to change. So I will go on with my speech, but I'll try to respond to some of the questions you have raised. 15th of August 21 marks the Black Day, where a proxy armed extremist group takes power in Kabul. On this day, Afghans lost their hope for a future where a durable peace can determine their human security. They lost their aspirations for an independent Afghanistan, where they can exercise their individual social, political, and socio-economic rights. The leaders of the de facto government, or regime rather, were surprised with their own sudden arrival, not only bringing uncertainty, fear, and volatility in lives of people, but with absence of rule of law and lack of governance. Their arrival spirals many myths, such as Afghanistan is a safe country and at peace. It is the Afghan culture that does not let its women to get out of the house or get an education. There is no threat to global peace and security from the geography of Afghanistan. So let me debunk those myths for you. Afghanistan is not a safe country or at peace because the country does not have a formal government or a governance structure. There is an absolute lack of law, and this is something that Mr. Bennett mentioned, that they go by Sharia, and I wish that they did go according to Sharia, but they go according to their interpretation of Sharia. Also, this absence of law is a point of insecurity, uncertainty, and chaos, not only for the citizens of Afghanistan, but the region and the world at large. Now, as per the Doha Agreement, and one of the 4 points that Mr. Khalizad was extremely adamant to propagate and stand by, which was reduction in violence. Indeed, reduction in violence has been met because the terror group that waged wars and violence now has grabbed power forcefully. A country that 20 million of its citizens face food insecurity according to WFP, and 6 million of its people famine, cannot be in peace. In 2 years of Taliban de facto rule, absence of rule of law, extremism is on the rise with mushrooming of madrasas all over the country, training of suicide bombers, change of educational curricula, and above all, elimination of women. It is Afghan culture that women do not get education. Let's debunk that. The Constitution of Afghanistan in 1921 was empowering women way before its regional countries. Women were given a voice. For example, in the country where I live now, in Switzerland, women were given the right to vote in 1970. So one must assess the mentality of Taliban as to where the idea of elimination of women comes from, how such elimination empowered their cause to keep Afghanistan an ignorant society, and above all, the consequences this has for development of Afghan society and its impact in the region and globally. The author of the book, Sex and the World Peace, makes a fundamental point that the states which do go to war over oil and scarce resources will do so in societies that have norms of gender inequality. Therefore, the foreseen fault line between civilization would be between states that treat women equally and those states that have their norms embedded in gender inequality. This gender inequality furthers the human insecurity in Afghanistan. I must also highlight that peace is not possible when the leadership of Taliban announce amnesty, but in effect, disappearances, arbitrary arrests are taking place, and Afghans operate in an environment of fear and suppression. So what can be done? Afghanistan's past 2 years' nightmare must be put to an end for regional and global stability, as well as human security of its citizens. Taliban are not a political force. They refused to be one during the peace process, rejecting a political settlement through a peace process, but rather chose to show their real face of terror by forcefully taking over. The geopolitics of the country dictates that Afghanistan has become a litmus test for regional and global stakeholders to prove their capacity for cooperation in order to obtain peace and security. Therefore, we must think out of the box in finding solutions for Afghanistan. The international community has a choice between engagement, legitimization of a radical proxy group, versus building a mechanism for national and international consensus. Who should be present at national discourse? Not only the Taliban and the Mujahideen or the warlords, but a third front representing the true voices of Afghanistan. Third front can succeed when it has space for dialogue with all players on issues such as national election, transitional justice, disarmament, equal rights for all citizens of a neutral Afghanistan, whereby regional and global stakeholders can reach a consensus for the stability, security, and economic growth in the region. Afghanistan as a sovereign nation can exist as a neutral state. Therefore, I recommend the following. Engagement with Taliban does not entail accepting their rule. Instead, discovering and defining mechanisms that put in place rather a discussion based on the rights of Afghan citizens. That is our political rights, which includes election, economic rights that include our economic development and growth to connect the region, and our social rights. For example, Mr. Bennett mentioned that they did away with the 2004 constitution. The Taliban say that they're implementing the Zahir Shah constitution. If they're implementing the Zahir Shah constitution, there is no space for democracy. Why? Because they don't allow political activities to be there or political parties to exist. Our national interest, regional and global security demand that Afghanistan is declared a neutral state, whereby regional and global political stakeholders in Afghanistan reach a consensus under the umbrella of UN on its neutral entity. This neutral status can be successful when at national level the political future of Afghanistan is shaped in creating a political system that can conduct elections, promote equal rights, food security, and economic growth. Afghanistan national interest, regional and international security is directly linked with debunking the jihad narrative that was introduced during the Cold War. It is the same jihad narrative that continues to date, radicalizing Afghan children, especially since the Taliban arrival 2 years ago. The recruitment of Afghan youth for unknown wars are at its peak. Afghanistan national interest is linked to global human security, that is access to education, healthcare, equal rights of its citizens, and food security, as I mentioned. Current poverty and the rule of the Taliban is the biggest danger for Afghanistan and the region because it perpetuates conditions for radicalization, exploitation of vulnerable groups, especially women and children. Therefore, a durable peace in Afghanistan can be guaranteed when two parallel processes, that is, one at national and the other at an international level, takes place simultaneously in reaching a consensus on political future of the country and thus the region's stability and global security. Thank you very much.